All right, so basically just kind of hooking it up in the studio. I mean, it's pretty simple. You've got a keyboard that you'd be using as some type of like a control surface, a new instrument or actual that is an actual control surface for different things. And basically the setup of those is that, I mean, you basically understand what you're trying. When you go to buy yourself a keyboard or another instrument or a control surface, that you've got a pretty good understanding of what you want to do anyway. I mean, when you've been looking into it, you want some type of control surface, an instrument or a keyboard that you're going to route in your studio for Midi. So you already got a pretty good understanding of what you want to do anyway. And so what you're doing from there, one thing is that, when you decide what control surface or instrument or keyboard that you're using, you're going to have to look at what it's able to send, and the parameters that are able to be adjusted and, and all those type of things, just about it. So whatever one you're actually using, we can't really address because, I don't know which one you're buying, but the basic concept of Midi, what it's able to receive and sending, is basically what you should be focused on when you buy it for what you're using it for in the studio. And that's really simple because we've already talked about those aspects, so that concept should be very easily applied. How well that they, put it together to where, how user-friendly it is for you to hook it up and understand what's going on, that's debatable, so, but I'm not, that's, I'm not sure. I've seen some that are very complicated, and I've seen some that were just really simple and user-friendly. So that's really going to depend, and I would really look into that to see that how complex the setup is and how user-friendly it is might be, one aspect of which one you're going to use. But basically, in this environment, setting it up, you're going to choose which MIDI channels, because are you going to have just a keyboard, a new instrument, a new control surface that you're going to assign different channels to. And we've already talked about channels, and that's in here. It's basically assigning all of them to it. But you can choose which channels. Like if you've got 3 or 4 keyboards and a couple different control surfaces, and a keyboard or two, or I mean, I don't know how complicated you might make it for what you think you need to do. And so you're going to have to choose channels for those. So that's real simple concept, and there's nothing really complicated about that. And then just receiving from and sending to, your device should have some type of a driver that came with it you've installed. So you're going to be wanting to route to that, and you're going to be wanting to receive from that and sending to that, or you might be sending just to Midi in and Midi out, depending on how you've configured it. So that's real simple. There's not really much complicated about that. And, the parameters, aftertouch, program change, pitch bend controllers, that might be on the surface or the keyboard, and which ones you want to use. And we've talked about that. And, if there's, you have questions about it, that you can always go back and review that. And then there's a split channels on here to where, you split the channels so that each channel that you've selected for that keyboard, where it can be actually selected as a separate instrument track while you're, tracking in the studio. So basically hooking that up, that's a basic, I mean, most things that you might be hooking it up, they might work a little bit differently, but with the understanding of what we've talked about the Midi itself, period, that, in these basic setups, that it shouldn't be, it should be fairly close to the same. Some things might be a little bit different that you might have to look into, but if you understand what we've talked about so far, that it shouldn't be that hard to understand what they're talking about and what they're wanting you to connect or choose if you want to use or not. And, in a new instrument, it's got the same thing, sending and receiving, and you've hopefully got a driver for that, or you're using just your Midi or Midi in and Midi out. Then you have to select your channels for that, depending on how many things you're using. Send Midi clock and use Midi clock start. And send Midi time code that your piece of software is sending that back to synchronize with the actual, instrument, so that, some things you might be using in it are, you're going to really want to be synchronized for whatever use you might be using it. Sometimes the timing of it is not going to be very pertinent at all. Sometimes it might be real pertinent depending on the application. So, I mean, that When you've gotten to a point where that starts to become fairly obvious, the timing issues because of something you're doing on your keyboard, then you're going to want to look into that a little bit more. But it's a very basic concept that we've already spoken of. And the automation, we've talked about now the automation interval, what it's doing between 10 milliseconds and 100 milliseconds. That's just addressing the automation we've talked about when we're looking at the piano roll editor and all the things that can be automated. I mean, we've talked about that and spoken about what things could be actually automated when you're doing automation. So I mean, that's going to be the automation interval. So that's real simple to understand, and it might not even be in your, what the piece of software you're working in, but it probably will. So if you don't really understand that, you should just read about it. It should be a paragraph or two inside of your software to explain that. The control surface is real simple, just to send and receive on here. So, that might be a little bit different. The concept of it is going to be mostly you're looking at how it's connected to your software and how well it interacts, what aspects can be controlled. And with what we've talked about MIDI, that's not a big deal. You already understand most of the basics of what it's dealing with. And the more complex issues are, as you try to build more complex systems, you may run into aspects that we've talked about that you may have to deal with routing and things like that, but most of the aspects are pretty basic. So, as you route it together and use that different equipment together, that, with the basic understandings we've talked about so far, it shouldn't be very hard for you to work out exactly how that needs to be configured. So basically, and if you're hooking up, hardware to other hardware, you're going to have the same things you're dealing with, and none of those, that basic things that MIDI are. I mean, we've talked about, instrument specific or software specific protocols and formats, and then that's something you have to look into depending on your instrument, your control surface, your software, any of those things. You kind of really want to know how they're connected. If they'll be using the same protocol, they can work together at all. Hardly. Some of them will. They'll use general MIDI and some other, not general MIDI things, some other protocols and some other formats that they might be able to work together, and some of them may not. But you need to just read into whatever software and hardware that you're using to make sure that the things we've talked about, that they're able to connect together. And that's probably the biggest thing you need to worry about. And other than that, the things we've discussed, I mean, unless you're getting into something very complex, that it should be fairly easy for you to route it and get things connected, and look and seeing it that way. It shouldn't, those things that you're going to have to deal with between one or the other, that they're pretty basic things that you have to look at. The only other thing in closing, the other last thing is that depending on what control surface you get or what keyboard or instrument, that a lot of times some of the things are very user friendly, and it's going to be very easy for you to go in there and adjust different parameters and MIDI things that are pertaining to the MIDI that you're sending or receiving. And some of them are not. Some of them are not user friendly. So you really need to, my biggest suggestion in that area is to try to find one. If you really want something, but it's complex, and it's not real user friendly, well, that's what you got to do, but if you can get, if your needs are simple, try to find something that's very user friendly, that you don't have to get, be messing with a whole lot of stuff that you really don't need. I mean, if you're just trying to get basics going, and sending and receiving MIDI information. So, I just kind of wanted to look at that because we didn't talk about that at all. But basically, and it wasn't to address it specifically so that now you're a MIDI guru on connecting things. It was just so that, to take a look in the studio and see, kind of how that's routed, so that you can understand for the most part that most of the time when you're trying to get things connected, that with that understanding of the basics we talked about, that it shouldn't be very hard. The issue you're going to run into is that, where you're going to find it in your DAW, where you're going to find it on your hardware, your keyboard, and to find that information, to access it, to use it. Does that make sense? But, those basic understandings normally, that once you figure out where you're supposed to, connect things and how to connect them and whatever software and hardware you're using, that the basic things that we've talked about using MIDI shouldn't be hard for you to understand what you're dealing with and what you need to hook up and why you need to hook that up. So I hope that covered that a little bit, just so that we just kind of brushed over that a little bit, just to show that, for the most part, that, it's a pretty user-friendly system, for basic applications. And, the basics of it, like anything else, can be built into more and more complex systems. But with the basic understanding of what's happening, and you taking it one step at a time and understanding what you're trying to use that system for, as you put it together and get it connected, that it shouldn't be that difficult with the understandings that you have at this point. So I hope you enjoyed the series. I hope you learned something, and have fun playing with MIDI.